All right, welcome back to the Pharisee Heresy. Daniel has been very busy editing his book, and one of the big sections in your one, I guess not big, but one of them is the Passover and its connections, the Last Supper. And I have three little questions for you here.
Thank you, Dr. Klein.
Yeah, some contradictions. How's the novel writing going?
It's good. It's been really fun, but also difficult, challenging, exciting, tedious. I'm excited to be back on another episode of the Pharisee Heresy so we can talk about all the things we've been studying together.
It's been a hot minute.
It has. I'm excited.
I've been enjoying it. It's a good read. So I know you got a lot of thoughts on this first one. So how,
all right.
There's probably a better way to phrase this, but how could Jesus, have the Last Supper, have a Passover meal, and then be crucified as our Passover sacrifice the next evening? As John states, he makes it pretty clear that he dies on Passover, and then the Synoptic Gospels seem to paint a different picture. And you have a good answer.
Okay. You want me to go with that one first and just go from there?
Well, we can talk about the others. The other ones are more in my wheelhouse, because the last time we did the Hanukkah stuff, I was talking about how part 3 is going to be the Sanhedrin, which I always make the joke. It's like the Star Wars prequels. You got the lightsaber fights and the escapes and the cool pod races. And you meet Darth Maul, then you're stuck in a Senate meeting for 15 minutes, and that's pretty much part 3. But as I'm reading this, reading your book, it's helped me put a fire into me. There's been a lot of good connections lately, so I'm really excited about that one. But we'll get to that question when we get there. But one of the questions is, how could Christ be tried? How could Stephen be tried by the Sanhedrin when they relinquished those abilities to try capital crimes in 30 CE? So I know you got some theories on that. And just from digging into the Jewish sources, the reason they give is, they're like, well, around 30 CE, there's some murders happening. There was these sects of Judaism that were fighting amongst each other. And just what I know of, Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, they had some differences, but it wasn't I'm going to stab you in the face kind of differences. It was
right.
What would make sense to me in my mind is that it was this new Christian sect. But how could there be a Christian sect? If Christ is dying at 33 CE. And it also would make a lot of sense if he died in 30 CE, then these, I wanted to say Palpatine, Pilate. Palpatine tried Christ, right? It's for bringing up Star Wars. Pilate, did not have a good experience there with that. And then Stephen also being stoned, that would probably be good reason for Rome to take away that right and to remove them from the Hall of Hewn Stone, which you guys might not know about, but I got lots of stuff on that.
Yeah, these are all great questions, and if I were just watching this presentation right now, I might think or say something like, why is this even important? Why isn't it all about Jesus and just celebrating? And yes, it is. But these are very important because they come with significant implications and ramifications, right, about our faith. Because, first of all, the fact that if you read the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you compare them with the chronology of John, then you're going to find what are apparent contradictions. They appear to be contradictions at face value, and skeptics latch onto these, and they will attack our faith. And that's why it's important to have a reasonable response for your faith, which which dives into the realm of apologetics. But I think that when we're intrigued by the apologetics part of it and defending our faith, will actually cause us to go deeper and learn more about these things, learn more about the crucifixion, learn more about the Last Supper, why these things took place and when they did, and then we find a lot of significance to those events.
I wasn't even like digging for contradictions. I was just studying the Sanhedrin, and you usually go to Judaism to that, and they just automatically started attacking the New Testament. They brought up this without me looking for it. They brought up this issue. So like, look, there's a whole
the capital punishment issue.
They're like, we couldn't have killed that. You're a Christian hero. We couldn't have done it. We didn't have that power in 33.
It's funny because
their argument.
There are a lot of chronology, experts, so they say, or teachers out there who really promote a 33 CE or AD crucifixion. And there's lots of reasons why. So in Luke, talking about it, certain time frames given, like the 15th year of Tiberius, around the time of Jesus' baptism, and then if his ministry was 3.5 years, and you're going up to 33 CE, and it takes you all the way back to the 70 weeks of Daniel. And so a lot of people land on 33 CE. And so now if we land on this, and this seems to be a pretty popular position, that and 30 CE seem to be two very popular positions, well, now you have Judaism that will come and say, well, how could it be possible that we killed your Messiah in 33 when the Sanhedrin lost its ability to try capital cases in 30 CE, 40 years before the destruction of the temple? And it's recorded in their writings that 40 years before the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, they lost their ability to try capital cases and to execute capital punishment. So it's interesting that 30 CE is the year that they lost it. I wonder why. That their power was revoked, and that even in their own words, that the presence of God began to depart from the nation, beginning at that time, starting with the chamber of hewn stone, starting with their loss of ability to try these cases, and eventually abandoning the temple and the nation as a whole when it was destroyed by the Romans. And in other words, God released his hand of protection over it. And so I think the contradictions go away as soon as you embrace a 30 CE crucifixion, which is where I landed after doing all my studies on the chronology, is that it happened in the year 30. So there's a lot of other implications that go with that, but share with us a little bit about what you've learned about the Sanhedrin and the Chamber of Hewn Stone, Nathaniel.
Well, it's my personal vendetta on Pharisee heresy to defend the Pharisees a little bit. It's kind of hard. I'm backed in a corner here with this one. Them trying Christ and killing our Messiah. Yeah, it's like, how are you going to defend the Sanhedrin here? But even just looking back at the origins of the Sanhedrin, that's what this whole PowerPoint. I'm not going to PowerPoint you to death because I got like 60 slides here, and I'm not even done. It's a long process, but it goes all the way back to Moses. When they talk about the seed of Moses, it's like him making halakha, which just means to walk. So you have the Torah after Mount Sinai, but there's a lot of other questions like, what does it mean to don't boil a calf in its mother's milk? What does that mean? And so they would bring these questions to Moses. And Moses eventually elected these 70 elders, which we know as the Sanhedrin. That's where you get that number 70, or 71 or 72 is even another number, and there's all reasons for that. But these would be just like our Senate. It would be all representatives from each tribe. And so they'd bring questions to these elders, and if it was a question that's already been asked, they would give them the answer. And if it became that big of a deal, they would take it to one of these lesser Sanhedrins. There'd be 3 of those. So during Stephen's trial, it was probably a lesser Sanhedrin. It was probably just 23 or 24 members, because it's not a feast day. One of the 3 pilgrim feast days would obviously be the 3 times they would get all the members together, because they're not going to travel all across Israel just for every single case, because they didn't have Skype back then, so it would take a bit. So they'd meet at these lesser, and if it be a split decision, they'd even take it higher. So that's just what's
so this is like
right.
So it's like as if when all 70 get together, it's like super important. It's like Supreme Court
It's
level.
very important, and with Stephen, it's odd that they would,
Okay.
that would be a no-no. You couldn't do that with 23 members. You couldn't judge him and stone him. You couldn't kill somebody with capital, but even if they had the power, they need all 70 to do it. Same with Christ. It's like they don't do it in the Hall of Hewn Stone. They take him to Caiaphas' house, and even though it was Passover, it's very likely that not all the Sanhedrin members were there. And it's my personal theory that if they were all there, especially with Stephen's death, they wouldn't have tried him like that. Because the Hillel Pharisees, which are mostly from the Galilee, so they'd be the ones that are farthest away, and the more likely to defend Stephen and Yeshua, wouldn't have been there. Especially if they're snuck away at night into Caiaphas' house,
Right. So when they tried Yeshua in the middle of the night, they didn't go to the chamber of hewn stone with all the 70. They went to Caiaphas' house with a small group and tried him there, correct?
That's right.
Right.
And this little thing down here is what I was trying to answer when I was thinking 33 CE. I was just trying to say, well, they killed Christ, and then Pilate didn't want to deal with this crap anymore, so he's like, all right, I'll let them have their Hall of Hewn Stone again, because when we read Acts 7 and we read about Stephen stoning, it's very clear that they're at least at the temple, very likely in the Hall of Hewn Stone. So how do they get back here if they've lost this power? So I was trying to answer that until I read your book. And you have a much better answer than I did. My answer is pretty bad, but I was just grasping at straws there, trying to come up with an explanation. So that was my idea there.
Yes. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but was my answer basically that it didn't happen in 33, that it was 30, and is that what harmonized it for you?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because if it's in 30, there's really no contradiction. They could have.
It makes everything make more sense.
Try cases at that point and pull it off, so to say.
And there's another slide where I have Stephen is the reason that's how they lost. That was the final thing that caused them to lose. And that harmonizes what we know of history. Like, why did they lose this power in 30 CE? What was the catalyst? Well, this makes so much sense. So it gives more credence to the Gospels and the New Testament if it is a 30 CE.
Because, in that year, they both crucified Yeshua and stoned Stephen. What's interesting is in the Bible, there's not a chronology given of when Stephen's stoning happened. It doesn't say, and Stephen was stoned in the same year as Yeshua, or Stephen was stoned in 30 CE, or anything like that. And what actually helped me, because I was curious about this for a while, couldn't figure out, I actually thought, well, maybe Stephen was stoned 3 years later in 33, or maybe whatnot, until I came across an article by Rick Lancer, and he's got some really good content with the Associates for Biblical Research, a website. He's got some really good articles there, but he goes into very deep into history and chronology, and gives biblical and historical evidence showing that Stephen was most likely stoned in the same year as Yeshua, based on some dating around Herod Agrippa, and that it was probably about 6 or 7 months later. So if Yeshua was, crucified on Passover, then you're looking at 6 or 7 months later. You're going from spring to fall, so you're looking at fall feast time frame for Stephen to have been stoned. And while I'm on that, I just want to read the quote from this is the Talmud in Sanhedrin 41a, verse 25. This is what the rabbis record. They say, 40 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, the Sanhedrin was exiled from the chamber of hewn stone and sat in the store near the Temple Mount. Once the Sanhedrin left the chamber of hewn stone, the court's power to judge capital cases was nullified. So there they have it. And then if we read also in another tractate called Rosh Hashanah, this is 31a, verses 14 and 19, they say this. This is very interesting. The divine presence, or the Shekinah, or the Shekinah, some people say, the divine presence traveled 10 journeys. It left the temple and the land of Israel in 10 stages at the time of the destruction of the first temple, as derived from verses. And corresponding to them, the Sanhedrin was exiled in 10 stages at the end of the Second Temple period and after the destruction of the temple. And this is known from tradition. From the chamber of hewn stone, its fixed seat in the temple, to Hanut, literally shop, a designated spot on the Temple Mount outside the temple proper, and from Hanut to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem to Yavne being where they compose the Talmud. So what the rabbis are saying here is that God's presence left. It left the temple and the land of Israel over 10 stages, beginning at the time when the Sanhedrin was first banned from the chamber of hewn stone, which was in 30 CE. Okay, so what they're saying is that the God's Spirit began to depart from the temple in Israel in the very year that Yeshua was crucified. But they don't say it's the year Yeshua was crucified. They just say 40 years before the destruction of the temple. Isn't that amazing?
There's so many things like that too, like with the Yom Kippur, the Azazel goat, and the string no longer turning white, and the veil being torn. Is that actually recorded at all in the Talmud? I don't know, probably not.
It is. Okay. It is. I'll read that to you. Check this out before I read that. Ezekiel chapter 8. This is verse 11. He's talking about all the abominations God is showing him that Israel is committing. In verse 6, he said, "Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The great abominations that the house of Israel is committing, to drive me far from my sanctuary. Yet you will see even greater abominations." So he's describing all these horrible things that they're doing, that God says drive him away from his sanctuary. Literally push his presence away. And he says, "Go in and see the wicked abominations they're committing." And I looked, and engraved around all the wall was every kind of crawling creature, detestable beast, and all the idols of the house of Israel. In verse 11 it said, "Before them stood 70 elders of the house of Israel, with Jezaniah son of Shaphan standing among them. Each had a censer in his hand, and a fragrant cloud of incense was rising. Son of man," he said, "do you see what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the darkness at each shrine of his own idol? For they are saying, the Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land." So here in Ezekiel, and this applied to Ezekiel's day, but God is giving us a shadow picture of saying they'll commit even greater abominations. And he says, do you see what these 70 elders of the house of Israel, with their censer in his hand, with their incense, they're doing in the darkness? So he's talking about idol worship. But it's fascinating to know now that in the gospel accounts it records that when they took Yeshua, it was in the cover of night in darkness, and they took them to Caiaphas' home where they sentenced him. And it was in this very year that they started to begin to drive the presence of Yahweh from the land. Now, you wanted me to share a little bit on the different miracles that stopped occurring that they record in the Talmud as well. Did you have something that you wanted to say there before I go there?
I can't remember what I was going to say, but I guess the only thing I want to say is that the Sanhedrin was divine. It was given as instruction, and the first record we have is right before the quail event in I think it's in Numbers 11, and it says the Spirit, the Ruach Hakodesh, filled the 70 elders. They prophesied. So it was appointed by God that they be these 70 elders, but yeah, they fell into sin. And another case I make in this is that it was actually, it was made from, we talk about Hebrews 8, it's a copy of what was in heaven. So it's my theory that there is, if you look at especially with Stephen's trial, Stephen's trying to make the case that, the Sanhedrin's being tried by the heavenly Sanhedrin, the heavenly council. Michael Heiser's work, the divine council, there's this idea that, there's these angels that make these decisions. They judge, and they had to judge Israel, so they were judging the Sanhedrin as they were judging Stephen. And then it's interesting because Stephen sees a picture of the Son of Man standing instead of standing, like he's putting a verdict on the Sanhedrin. So they're the ones being judged and not Stephen. It's very interesting.
Right. Yeah, that is so cool. Where they attempt to pronounce a judgment on Stephen as they stone him, yet he pronounces condemnation and the judgment of God on the elders, the leadership of Israel, and talking about how they have stoned the prophets and such and so forth.
And his whole speech is very interesting, but we get to that later, because I think everything he's saying is about the Sanhedrin. He's talking about the history of Sanhedrin, every time they messed up.
That is fat. Let's get to that. So let me cover these verses. So here we go. This is Mishnah Yoma 39b 5. So just so
do you want to share
people that are watching?
So I can close this because
I don't have it up on this computer.
Oh, that's fine.
I'll just have to read it.
Yeah, just read.
Besides, yours is much more pretty than mine. So the Mishnah was written earlier than the rest of the Talmud. The Mishnah is more of a recording of things that occurred and traditions that were held in the time of the first century. And then where you get later in the Talmud, you get a lot more of like theological debate and midrash and stuff like that. But when I read Mishnah, I think this is more likely an accurate representation of the traditions and beliefs that were held and practiced in the first century. So now when you read Mishnah Yoma 39b verse 5, it says, the sages taught during the tenure of Shimon HaTzadik, the lot for God always arose in the high priest's right hand. After his death, it occurred only occasionally. But during the 40 years prior to the destruction of the Second Temple, the lot for God did not arise in the high priest's right hand at all. So too, the strip of crimson wool that was tied to the head of the goat that was sent to Azazel did not turn white, and the westernmost lamp of the candelabrum, or the menorah, did not burn continually, as it's supposed to. Okay, so what they're saying is God basically gave Israel these signs that on Yom Kippur that he had forgiven them of their sins and that they were in right standing with him. And so one of these signs was that the lot ascribed to Yahweh would always appear in the right hand of the high priest when the lots were cast for the two goats of Yom Kippur. That's in Leviticus 16, 8 through 10, the Yom Kippur service. And this would be considered a fortuitous omen, so a good sign. Another sign was that the strip of scarlet-dyed wool, which was tied to the head of the scapegoat, always turned white during the Yom Kippur service. So, your sins are red as scarlet, but I'll turn them white as snow, kind of a thing. And then a third sign was that the westernmost lamp of the menorah would burn continually; it would never go out. But the sages actually report in the Mishnah that beginning in 30 CE, all three of those signs stopped occurring, indicating that God had removed his favor from the land, from the leadership of Israel, and that he did not look on them with favor. So, but there's a fourth sign, and that was that the doors of the holy place opened by themselves. So this was obviously the holy place was restricted only to the priests, And it was separated from common areas by the veil to the most holy place and the doors to the sanctuary. All right, so now Luke records the veil was torn at the death of Yeshua. That's in Luke 23:45. Now we go back to the Mishnah. Mishnah Yoma continues on, and this is 39b, verse 6. And it says, "And the doors of the sanctuary opened by themselves as a sign that they would soon be opened by enemies, until Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai scolded them. He said to the sanctuary, 'Sanctuary, sanctuary, why do you frighten yourself with these signs? I know about you that you will ultimately be destroyed, and Zechariah son of Iddo has already prophesied concerning you. Open your doors, O Lebanon, that the fire may devour your cedars, Lebanon being an appellation for the temple.'" So this guy that the Mishnah is talking about, Yochanan ben Zakkai, he was referencing the prophet Zechariah in chapter 11. And there, Zechariah prophesied destruction of the temple and the removal of a covenant of favor upon Judah. There, interestingly enough, Zechariah also prophesied, that's where he prophesied 30 pieces of silver being given to the potter. And then we read in Matthew 27 that what did Judas betray Yeshua for? 30 pieces of silver. And then when he threw it back, what did they use that money for? To buy the potter's field. Okay, so it's interesting that the Mishnah is its own testimony that they fell out of favor in the year that they crucified our Messiah, their Messiah, and likened it to Zechariah chapter 11 that talks about God's judgment coming on them and the doors of the temple being open for their enemies, and then they report that the doors of the temple after 30 CE would open by themselves. So they kind of condemned themselves with these writings.
It's insane, like that they have these writings. It's
yeah, and it seems very reasonable to believe.
And they're so self-aware
because it doesn't serve them
in
to
these
say it.
in the Talmud, and I don't understand why Christians don't want to read the Talmud, because there's so much there, and it's almost like these are two different people. You know, it's the Sanhedrin that convicted Christ, and the people, the Sanhedrin that, you know, they issued. You know, the last act of the Sanhedrin was to make the oral Torah written Talmud, because they knew they weren't going to allow, you know, with Constantine, all that, they weren't going to allow to continue being together because there was so much anti-Semitism there. They couldn't meet as a Sanhedrin, they couldn't do their feasts. So their last two acts was to set the calendar, make it fixed, and write down the oral Torah, issue that. So that's when it started being written. It obviously took much longer, I think up to like 500, you know, CE, but that's crazy. And one of the answers I know is that, you know, the Judaism we have today is mostly Hillel. It's Bet Hillel, and at the time of Christ, it was the opposite. It was House of Shammai, and there was the Sadducees, were in the main power in Jerusalem, and probably who were sitting in that council with Christ and with Stephen.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. You know, if you neglect to study the Talmud or even just Jewish history around the time, you miss so much, and it's so easy to paint with broad strokes because, like you said, there were vast differences and technical differences between the different sects of Judaism, even within Pharisaic Judaism. You have the house of Shammai and Hillel, and they disagreed on several things, and they approached things very differently. There are several instances where Yeshua would teach things in a way that was reminiscent of or supportive of the teachings of Rabbi Hillel, and how he would interpret a matter in contradistinction to how Shammai would interpret a matter. You know, like the old story where, you know, a guy comes up to Shammai and he says, "Teach me the whole Torah while standing on a stick or something like
1
that.
foot.
Like 1 foot, yeah, standing on 1 foot. And Shammai like whacks him with the stick and says, get out of here. I'm butchering the story. But then when Hillel is asked, teach me the whole Torah while standing on 1 foot, and he says, basically, do unto others, as you would have them do unto you.
The rest is commentary, is what he says.
Yeah, the rest is commentary, he says. And what does
Which
Yeshua
is the
say
Talmud. The Talmud is just commentary. People think they treat it like they're scripture. Like, no, right, it has actually disagreements within it on purpose to show the different, like, house of Shammai, house of Hillel, where they would disagree. This rabbi said this, and this rabbi said this, and all that stuff you read, that great insight, and it's crazy.
I've heard it said that the Talmud is like a complex set of math problems, of calculus, and trying to figure out.
Well, there's some boring parts, yeah.
And there's some boring parts, but the answer to those problems are the New Testament. There's your answer. The answer you're looking for is found in what Yeshua teaches. So, I'm intrigued about what you were talking about there with Stephen. Do you want to head back that direction?
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
Let's see. So yeah, this is the first time the Lord anointed. There was the 70 before with Jethro, and there's even a mention of elders in Exodus 3, which I think Stephen's getting at, because he mentions that the elders were too afraid. They said, they also said, like, who made you judge over us, kind of thing. So it's just showing again, like, all of their saviors. I'm trying to find it here. Oh, I keep hitting that by mistake. All of their, like, the messianic figures, like even like Joseph was, rejected by Jacob, and his brother is like, you think you're going to be over us, kind of thing. And then they all eventually, 70. Stephen says 75, but the Masoretic would have said 70 went down to Egypt. I got too much stuff here. There's the divine. I really want to talk about the divine council one of these days. It's too much for today. Hurt people's brains. Exciting. There we go. Stephen could be the reason.
Okay.
I'll get back to what I was saying. So the holy place he mentions there in Acts 7 or Acts 6, I guess. So that's indicating that maybe it's what you were saying, where they're close to the temple, but it makes it sound like they're in the hall hewn stone here, and that they have the power of capital punishment. And everything we mentioned, no feast is mentioned. So here's just talking about the 70 went down to Egypt, and then Joseph's rejected. These are all things that Stephen brings up his little speech there, and how Moses was rejected by the elders. They went to the elders originally. And then you have the 70 elders who go up on the mountain, Mount Sinai, with Moses, and they eat before Yahweh. It's a crazy story I don't really remember, but it's there in Scripture that they're eating. Or like, why are you eating before Yahweh? And one rabbi I was listening to is that's why they were killed and then replaced, because we get to Numbers 11, which is right after this, after they leave Mount Sinai, that he's selecting new ones. It's like, well, what happened to those 70? Because even though they go up on the mountain, they eat before Yahweh, what's the next thing that happens? The golden calf. It's like, you just met with the Lord. Whether you saw him in a vision, I don't know, but and he spoke with you, and now you're going to go make an idol. Does
it say what they ate?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Because that made me think of something, is that, in the temple, the showbread sits on a table called the table of presence. And so does the pitchers of wine. And when the priests eat from that, they're eating in the presence of Yahweh. And so they're sharing that meal. And each of the 12 loaves of the showbread are representative. They're a memorial of each of the 12 tribes. So the whole congregation of Israel is represented in those 12 loaves that are the bread of presence. And so it's like a meal shared with God, like you're talking about these 70
Yeah.
elders. And if you look at the bread of presence, and it's a memorial offering or a remembrance offering. When Yeshua does the Last Supper with his 12 disciples, he says, "Do this in remembrance or memorial of me." And they ate, and so they were eating in his presence. And so I think now if we go back and we look at the Last Supper, which is called the Lord's Supper or communion, and we look where Paul talks about how some people are eating with what does it say? They eat it.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, they what's the word? I can't think of the word, but they don't have the right heart as they're eating this food. They said this is why many of you are sick or dead, because you have eaten this presumptuously, and you've not taken it seriously. And
So it might not be more that they ate, but the manner in which they ate and where their heart was.
the manner, like these 70 elders that go up to eat in his presence, and then they engage in revelry.
Yeah.
So if we come together to break bread with our brothers, but we have false hearts, it's just about a rote obedience or some ritual, and not actually wanting to dine with the Father like Abraham did with Melchizedek, or like he did with the oaks of Mamre when they made, the bread and the cheese curds and all that for the angel of the Lord, eating in his presence. I think that's what the Last Supper was all about.
Good connection.
Not so much a Passover Seder, which I don't believe it was. I think it was a bread of presence that he was teaching us, almost like he knew the temple would be destroyed. And so here is your sacrament that you participate in as a body. This is the bread of presence for you to do in remembrance of me.
We should get into that Last Supper right now. Yeah. Yeah. All I was saying is
I didn't mean to hijack your Stephen.
No, I think that's a good point. It was just, that's what a rabbi said, is that's why they died. But I think it's more that they died because they were the elders and they should have stopped this golden calf thing. They clearly didn't.
Yeah.
So either they were died when the 3,000 were killed then, right? The Levites went out with their swords. Or there's also, I think Rashi mentions that they were killed by a fire right before that, the quail, when they're grumbling about the manna, and then God gives them the quail. Then people die from the quail. But that's when the new 70 elders are selected, and they're given the Holy Spirit, which I think is interesting.
Man, that is interesting.
And then, Stephen mentions the heavenly, temple, this heavenly Sanhedrin idea, and I think it's the idea that, okay, I'm on trial, but you're really on trial, kind of thing going on, which I think is really cool. And there's some pictures of the Divine Council. But yeah, why don't you? Oh yeah, there's some more. I thought that, this is from my NRSV Cultural Context Bible. It says this is the kind of the trial idea. So why is the Son of Man standing rather than seated? Contrast Luke. Witnesses would stand and judges could stand to render their verdict. This may imply that it is Stephen's accusers and not Stephen who is really on trial before the Lord. Ancient writers sometimes depicted unjust judges as the ones really on trial before God or the bar of truth. I thought that was very cool.
Because when that happened, Stephen looked up, the heavens opened up, and he saw the Son of Man standing in heaven.
That's when they lost it and pulled him out of there.
Wow.
And this is kind of from
Makes you wonder if
40
Caiaphas
years.
was there and he saw the vision as well. He looked up and saw the Son of Man in power, standing. It also is a throwback to Daniel 12, where it talks about Michael will stand up for your people. So, Michael, a lot of people debate who is the angel Michael, the archangel. And some people believe he's a created being, and other people believe that he is just a title of Yeshua, the pre-incarnate Yeshua, that he is the angel of the Lord. And there's a lot of that you go into with translating archangel and how you translate that. It could be one of the chief princes, or it could be the one chief prince, or foremost. And so that's where you can get in debates on who is Michael. But Daniel 12 talks about Michael standing up. And so it's this picture of judgment that's going to occur. And it's Michael and his armies that return from heaven in Revelation to judge the earth. So there's a lot there. But this picture of standing up is definitely a judgment. So sorry, continue on there.
No, I think my final Sanhedrin thought here is that I just like the idea of like God having a council. It's not that God needs counsel. It's just so it almost is a self-check. Like he wants to save Israel. He does. But there you have like even Satan shows up every once in a while in God's counsel. Like look at Job. He shows up as like the plaintiff to bring a case. And in the Sanhedrin, how it would work is the lower members would vote on something. So it's rare, very rare that the president would ever have to vote in the Sanhedrin. The God obviously would be the president in this situation. So yeah, they act in his will, but like a judgment has to be made against Israel here. That's where 70 CE comes in, the judgment and the destruction. Like everything goes through this council. It's just and it's fair. A lot of people say God's making all these decisions. He isn't. He isn't. He has this council for a reason, and it's a constant courtroom thing, and I'm sure the adversary Satan shows up often to bring cases against, he hates Israel, he hates God's chosen people.
Yeah, and I think God wants to see how we treat each other. He could run the whole show and make us all robots, but that's not what he did. He gave us free will. He wanted to allow us the opportunity to show basically our worthiness, so to say. And so you look at the scriptures where it talks about how in the millennium that we will become judges, that we will judge the angels. And so based upon our standing in Messiah and our fruit and what we've done, God will make some of us judges.
Maybe that's looking back on what the angels decided in these elders. Like I used to think they were humans, but now I think the elders mentioned, like in Revelation, are these angels who have made a lot of these decisions. So the turmoil that we've had to go through for the past 6,000 years have been some of their decisions.
Right.
Which is a weird thing to think about. I know, and that's probably the biggest heresy I'm going to say all night, so I'll be quiet. There's a different way to think about it for sure.
That's what we're here for. So, with Stephen, some touches there is that now that if you line this time up, you see a picture of another Jonah sign here, because Jonah, when he landed on the shore after being spit up from the fish, he went to Nineveh, preached to the Gentiles there, and it says it took him 3 days of traversing the city to tell them of their impending judgment that would occur in 40 days. And so from 30 CE to 70, the destruction, when Judah received their judgment, was 40 years. And so if you go back to the Daniel 70 weeks that began in 458 BC, it takes you all the way to 33 CE, the end of the 70 weeks. So you've got from 30 to 33, 3 days, 3 years of basically this message of, hey, repent. I think that the judgment was laid on Judah by Messiah in 30 CE, and the condemnation, the condemnation fell on Judah when they crucified Messiah, and then Stephen pronounced the judgment against them that would come, and it came 40 years later. And so you have this 3-year window that like is a finish up of the between 30 and 33 from the time that that Jonah would arrive to pronounce judgment, that right to 3 days later. You correlate that to 3 years, you get to the end of the 70 weeks in 33. Now if you have the same starting point in 30 CE, and you take Jonah's 40 total days before they would receive judgment, make that 40 years, you get to 70 CE. So now you have a picture there of a Jonah sign in Stephen. There's like lots of synchronisms with the sign of Jonah in many ways. And at Stephen's stoning, who was there? Paul was there. Paul of Tarsus, and he said that Stephen's coat, like this coat, was thrown at the feet of Saul, and Saul became this great witness to the Gentiles specifically. And what I think is interesting about Saul is he came from Tarsus.
I like how you mentioned that.
Look at
the cloak. I never really thought about that. It's like Elijah, Elisha picking up getting the
mantle,
the double
so
portion or whatever of Stephen.
Like Stephen was saying, hey, judgment's coming. And Paul was right there participating in his stoning, but the coat landed at his feet, and what happened to Paul? He had this great vision, and he became the apostle to the Gentiles to preach repentance and forgiveness of sins and restoration, and joining Israel. And where Paul came from was Tarsus, which, if you look at Jonah, and when he was trying to travel away from God, and he was thrown off the ship and swallowed by a whale and spit up. People have different theories about where the whale took him, and the Bible doesn't say specifically. But when I look at a map and I look at the closest point to Nineveh, going directly west from Nineveh, is Tarsus. So I believe the whale spit Jonah up in Tarsus, and from Tarsus he traveled to Nineveh to preach repentance to the Gentiles. And
he was the first
Tarsus
one to go outside Israel and to preach.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't really think about that either. It's like, what prophet was sent outside of Israel?
That's true. Yeah.
I found one other case. Elijah goes outside but it's just to select a king, and it's just like slightly outside. But like Jesus doesn't even really leave Israel.
Right. I mean, they go through the lands of the Samaritans, that was the lost tribes, the lost house of Israel.
I count that as Israel.
Yeah. It is Israel. It is part of it.
And Stephen, before he died, said, like, Lord, forgive them. Like, he knew, like, judgment was coming, like you're saying. Just like Jesus did, like, forgive them, kind of. They don't know what they're doing. But
so
the council has spoken.
We're getting up on an hour. Are there some final thoughts you want to throw in there for tonight?
I think we're good on that. I don't know if you wanted to touch on the Last Supper, if that's too much of a...
Well, how about we cue it off for next time, or maybe we talk a little bit about it. But so, Last Supper, from the very beginning of tonight, we talked about the how
double portion podcast.
Yeah. We talked about like the Synoptic Gospels disagreeing with the Gospel of John, and one of those big disagreements is, when did the Last Supper occur? And people think, the Synoptic Gospels say the Last Supper occurred on the 14th of Nisan, or Aviv, on Passover Day. But then the Gospel of John makes it very clear that it happened the day before Passover, the 13th. And so, which is true? Well, the answer is they're both true, and both teach that it happened on the 13th of Nisan. And that's one of the things I go through in this chapter in the book.
There you go.
Gotta buy the book when it comes out. But or you can wait 5 years for me to finally talk about it on the Pharisee Heresy podcast. Right. But so the thing
Tune
is
in next
that,
Passover for the answer.
Yeah. But the way it works is that the Last Supper occurred on a Thursday evening, on the 13th of Nisan, and the crucifixion occurred on a Friday, on the 14th of Nisan. Now, all the Messianics are going to want to crucify me for this, right? And then the resurrection occurred on a Sunday, on the third day. And so one of the issues that we get is, a lot of people have trouble with this idea of a Friday crucifixion and a Sunday resurrection, because you have to fit the sign of Jonah in there, the 3 days and the 3 nights. So how do you fit 3 days and 3 nights between a Friday and a Sunday? And this is almost like a joke, and in Hebrew roots circles, like a laughing matter of like, haha, stupid Christians, they always thought it was Friday to Sunday. Have they never read about the 3 days and 3 nights? And
they can't do basic math.
Yeah, they can't do basic math. Like, that's the running joke. And then you have all these calendars, propositions of when all these things took place with the high Sabbath, and all this sort of stuff.
There's whole calendars based off this Last Supper issue.
Yeah,
I've seen
tons of different
even new calendars getting started recently. It's just,
there are people that believe that Jesus was on a separate calendar from the priesthood.
I have two different friends.
That he was on a secret
just
calendar
in my
that he didn't even tell his
area
disciples about.
that have already kept Passover, but on different dates.
Yeah. And so, at the end of the day, I have my opinion on what I think the right calendar is. We all have our opinion, okay? And I think that what's most important is going back to, how do we treat each other? God's looking to see how we respond when we have a lack of information. What are we going to do with the information we have? Are we going to take it and chop other people's heads off? Or are we going to try to get along and keep the feast the best we can as a memorial? Because none of these feasts are legal. We don't have a priesthood. We don't have a Sanhedrin. We don't have a temple. We don't have a kosher lamb. We don't have all these things.
There was no disagreements. If the Sanhedrin issued a decree and issued a new law, that the 70, you couldn't go home and preach something different.
Right.
That was a hanging offense.
Right. Yeah. That was the law of the land, and that was the way God ordained it.
And it kind of makes sense.
So, yeah,
they didn't have 40,000 different congregations and different belief systems. They had one. Torah was law. There was no separation of church and state. It was just,
yeah. So the resolution to the Last Supper in a 1 minute soundbite is that it happened on the 13th, which was a Thursday night, and this was a what do you call it? It's a Hagigah meal. Hagigah means a feast meal. So Hag, from we talk about Hag Sameach, happy feast, and so Hagigah would be a festival. Celebration or meal. And so why would you do these meals? Well, anytime you have one of these pilgrimage feasts, you would do several meals. You'd get together with your friends and hang out, have meals and have fun and party. And so the festival of unleavened bread became colloquially known as Pesach or Passover. So even though Passover is a one-night thing, the whole festival in common use was interchangeable with the word Passover or unleavened bread. So if you said it, unleavened bread was approaching, it was like you were saying Passover is approaching. You were saying Passover is approaching, it's like unleavened bread. Same thing happened with the lambs. So you could have a Pesach that's being prepared, and that Pesach does not mean it's the lamb, the Paschal lamb that's sacrificed in the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan, because there are several Pesachim. You go back to Chronicles and First Kings, and that even bulls and oxen are referred to as Pesachim, the plural of Pesachs. So Pesach doesn't have to be a lamb. So now we can see how we can separate from having to force this meal to have occurred on the 14th. And so what's happened, why would they have a meal of a lamb or anything called a Pesach on the 13th? Well, in the Talmud,
it doesn't even mention there's a lamb, right?
No, it doesn't. It does not mention it as lamb. Just to go prepare the Pesach. Okay, so what was required at that time for any traveler was that they would have to bring a offering of thanksgiving, okay? A shelamim, a peace offering. And there are different shelamems, but a shelamim that has a thanks offering attached to it, so that would be a shelamim offering of thanksgiving. And so, for example, if you brought a lamb, you'd have to bring loaves of flour. You have to bring bread made with 1 ephah. If you brought a ram, it'd have to be 2 ephahs. If you brought a bull, it'd have to be 3 ephahs. And so, and within that, there's 4 different kinds of bread you'd have to make. 3 of those are unleavened and 1 is leavened. Okay, and so with a Thanksgiving offering, there's always leavened bread that is brought. Now, leavened bread is never burned on the altar, okay? But it is a sacrifice. It is offered and eaten by you, eaten by the priests. And so what happened was the rabbis ruled that if you traveled overseas or through the desert or encountered any sort of danger, so basically if you were coming from the Galilee, then the scripture, the Torah says, do not appear before me empty-handed. So when you appear before Yahweh, you have to bring something. And so they required that as if you pilgrimaged to Jerusalem, then you need to bring a thank offering for mercy, for travel mercies, essentially. So this being the 13th, which is the big preparation day, the day that evening where they would have to get all the leaven out of their houses before they sacrifice the Passover lamb, because no leaven can come with the Passover lamb on the 14th, right? So they're getting all this leaven out. It's a preparation. So they are going to do this shelamim offering on the 13th, on the evening of the 13th. And that would require a leavened piece of bread as well. And so that's why they required them to do it on the 13th and not any time after that. Because if they were to do this thank offering on the 14th, well, a peace offering can be eaten up to I think 24 hours later. Okay, or it might have even been 2 days, I don't remember. But what they said was, you need to make sure that you do your peace offering the day before the Passover lambs are slain, so that by chance there's no leaven from your sacrifice left. You need to have enough that you eat it all and don't leave any over. So you need to have a whole evening, a whole day to eat all this.
That's what always made sense to me.
You got to do it on the 13th.
You got to have a party to eat all the leaven before Passover.
Right. Well, because on other feasts, let's say it was Tabernacles, you could do it any day. You could do your thanks offering because leaven was allowed at any point in the feast. So if you were traveling from wherever, you could do it on the 15th, 16th, didn't matter. But on Passover, no leaven allowed after noon on the 14th. So they said, guys, when it comes to Passover, do your shelamim offering of Thanksgiving on the 13th so you have time to get rid of all the leaven. So that's what they were doing. And any festival meal that you would keep during the festival would be called a Hagigah. And if the festival was Pesach, you would call it a Pesach Hagigah or a Pesachim. So when you say go and prepare the Pesach, it doesn't mean it has to be the lamb of the 14th. So that's the short version of that without all the details. But yeah, so they had the Last Supper on the 13th, and then they did Passover on the 14th when Yeshua was crucified.
I also like how you mentioned
the resurrection on the third day.
Last Supper is not just his Last Supper because he was going to die, but a Last Supper is actually a Hebrew. You would have a meal. Mm-hmm. It was your Last Supper before you do a fast, which was common as well, right? They would fast. They'd have this big party meal, this Pesach, and then they'd fast until the Passover meal.
It's a tradition that continues on today.
What was the name of that in Hebrew?
Ta'anit Bechorot.
Yeah, I knew I was going to be able to say it. So.
Bechorot, I don't know. Ta'anit Bechorot, I think.
I've heard it called the Fast of the Firstborn, too.
Yeah, Fast of the Firstborn. Yeah, so to commemorate the Exodus, essentially. So that night, the 13th, they would fast until they ate the lamb. So that makes sense then after the meal. He said, I won't eat of this until I eat it in the kingdom. And where do they go? They go to pray. Because what do you do when you fast? You pray. They go to the garden to pray. And yeah, you know what happens from thenceforth. So the 3 days and 3 nights thing, it's just a colloquialism that could mean any portion of 3 consecutive days. So inclusive reckoning, meaning a partial day counts as a day. And you can prove this through Scripture. You can define 3 days and 3 nights using the Bible. So people try to make a sticking point out of this, but if you actually use the Bible to define 3 days and 3 nights, and you go back and see how it's used in Scripture elsewhere, it proves that 3 days and 3 nights does not mean 72 hours or 3 full days and 3 full nights. Literally, it's a colloquialism, because Esther, you can go back and read the story of Esther, and you will see that she said, pray for 3 days and 3 nights, pray and fast with me, and after 3 days and 3 nights, I'll go in before the king. But what has happened in the story? It says, on the 3rd day, she went before the king, not after the 3rd day. So she defines it. The Bible defines it itself, and it's actually a picture to show what Yeshua did. He's on the 3rd day he resurrected after 3 days and 3 nights, because it's a colloquialism. So there you have the harmonization, folks. And then you go into the astronomy, and you see that in 30 AD, Passover landed on a Friday. If you're following what the temple priesthood did, which was to look for the first light sign, the crescent.
And there's also a lot of that in your book, too, the astronomy.
Yeah, tons of that. Maybe we can talk about that another time.
What do you, absolute chronology, is that? Did I get that right?
Absolute chronology is in there. Absolute chronology is so when we look at chronology and we look at time, how do we know when things happened? Something that is absolute, that we know, okay, we know 100% this is when this happened. We call that absolute chronology. And there's different ways to derive that. One of those is through astronomy. We can pinpoint, we can triangulate certain events using astronomy and prove that we know when they happen.
I think you mentioned Nineveh with like a solar eclipse or something.
The Bur Sagale eclipse. Now, it's not 100% proven that it occurred then. So this wouldn't be an example of absolute chronology, but it would be an example of something that lines up really well with prophecy, because it would happen at the same time frame that Jonah went to Nineveh, was this Bur Sagale eclipse. So when he arrived and said, your judgment is coming, all of a sudden there's an eclipse and the whole land turns to darkness, and then they're like, okay, we should listen to this guy. And it just so happens that happened on the day of the crucifixion in 30 CE as well. So you have 3 hours of darkness.
That astronomy is also pointing to the 30 CE crucifixion, and well, at least
the astronomy,
at least for his birth. I think you mentioned in one of our earlier videos, you talked about Christ's birth and using the Magi star and trying to Regulus or something like that, and figuring that all out.
There's different things we can do with astronomy. One of those is absolute chronology for dating certain events. One of those is looking at interpretation of the Mazzaroth and what is the star of the Magi to determine his birth. That's a little bit more fluid and based on interpretation. Sure. But if you can match it with other indicators, you could get what's most probable thing that the sign would have been. And then the third thing is trying to determine true dates of like biblical dates using the biblical calendar. So like, when did the first day of the year start in 30 CE? Well, the only way you can do that is to look at the astronomy to see, okay, when was the new moon, and when was the equinox, and was the new moon after the equinox? What time was it? All those sorts of things to know what the 14th of Nisan was in 30 CE, and find out it's a Friday, unless you're a conjunctionist.
And you're not alone with this 30 CE date, right? It's not just you in your basement.
Oh yeah, no, it's very popular position.
It's not just Daniel making up crazy things again.
Amongst scholars, they pretty much go back and forth between 30 and 33. And we've talked about it. Just a few reasons why 33 doesn't work, but there's tons of those. in the book.
Good.
But
All right. We'll let you go.
that was fun.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Doc. Yeah, you have to stop me or I'll just keep ranting.
Oh, I'm that double portion.
Yeah, maybe we can dive into some.
You
more
already
next
said
time.
1 minute, and I think I squeezed 15 out of that 1 minute, so
Yes,
I'll
I
take
love
that.
Well, thanks again, Dr. Klein.
Thanks for coming back on to tell us about your book, and good luck working on that. And come on again soon.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I appreciate
In all
it.
your spare time. I don't even know how to close
I'm
this
going to
thing.
log off the Facebook. Goodbye, Facebookers.
Bye-bye, you Pharisees.